The copper taste of blood still lingered on Kieran Drake's tongue as he stepped from the warehouse's shadow into Charleston's pre-dawn darkness. 20,000 in cash weighing down his jacket pocket from the underground poker game that had turned violent an hour before midnight. At 28, he'd learned to navigate the city's criminal underbelly with surgical precision, his reputation as someone who resolved disputes without unnecessary bloodshed, making him valuable to the families who controlled the port. The historic district's cobblestones gleamed wet under streetlights, antebellum architecture standing witness to transactions that would never appear in legal records, and Kieran moved through this world like a ghost who'd forgotten how to be human. The sound hit him before the impact, small footsteps running desperately, breath coming in panicked gasps that cut through the humid night air with terrifying clarity. Kieran's hand moved instinctively toward the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. Survival instincts honed through years of navigating betrayal and ambush, but he froze when the source of the sound collided directly with his legs. A child stood before him, maybe 4 years old, blonde curls escaping from beneath a thin hood, red dress visible under a coat that had been nice once, but now bore the unmistakable signs of careful repair and desperate preservation. "Sir, my mom didn't wake up," the little girl said, her voice carrying a steadiness that seemed impossible for someone so small, blue eyes looking up at him with a trust that made something twist painfully in Kieran's chest. He'd spent the last decade building walls between himself and anything resembling vulnerability, but this child's gaze penetrated defenses he hadn't known could be breached. Her small hand reached out to grasp his wrist with surprising strength, fingers ice-cold even through the expensive fabric of his shirt, and Kieran felt the world he'd carefully constructed begin to shift beneath his feet. "What do you mean she didn't wake up?" The question emerged rougher than intended, years of cultivated menace making even genuine concern sound like a threat, but the child didn't flinch from his intensity. She tugged at his hand with increasing urgency, pulling him toward a narrow alley between buildings that wealthy tourists would never see, where Charleston's carefully preserved history gave way to reality its Chamber of Commerce preferred to ignore. Kieran's mind calculated risks automatically. This could be a setup, some rival family's elaborate trap, a play against him when his guard was down. But the genuine terror in the child's expression made such calculations feel obscene. The night air carried scents of garbage and desperation, of lives lived in the margins of a city that prided itself on charm and hospitality, and Kieran felt anger rising in his throat, alongside something he refused to name. "She was coughing really bad and her skin got hot like the stove, and I tried to shake her but she won't open her eyes." The words tumbled out in a rush as they moved deeper into the alley, the girl's small legs working frantically to maintain pace with Kieran's longer stride. They reached a rusted fire escape, clinging to a building that should have been condemned, and the child began climbing with practiced efficiency that spoke of too many nights navigating these metal bones alone. Kieran followed, his mind already identifying exits and threats, even as he recognized the absurdity of treating a child's crisis as a tactical situation requiring strategic assessment. The fire escape groaned under his weight, metal protesting centuries of neglect and moisture that corroded everything in this coastal climate. But it held. They climbed 3 stories, each landing revealing windows into lives that existed just blocks from million-dollar homes where people slept without fear of eviction or hunger or illness that couldn't be treated. The girl moved with heartbreaking confidence, clearly having made this journey countless times, and Kieran wondered what kind of world created children who navigated fire escapes at 4 years old with the competence of seasoned criminals. "Here," she whispered, stopping at a window that opened easily despite the broken lock, and Kieran understood immediately that security was a luxury these residents couldn't afford. He lifted her through first, then followed, dropping into a studio apartment that measured perhaps 300 square feet, every inch meticulously organized to maximize space that would never be enough. The air inside was thick with fever heat and the sweet, sick smell of infection, and Kieran's stomach clenched with recognition of scents he'd encountered too many times in his line of work, though never in circumstances quite like these. The woman lay on a narrow bed against the far wall, blonde hair darkened with sweat plastered to skin that burned with a flush Kieran could see from across the room, even in the dim light filtering through grimy windows. She was young, maybe 26 or 27, with features that echoed the child's but carved with exhaustion that aged her beyond her years, and her breathing came in shallow gasps that spoke of lungs struggling against infection that had progressed far beyond what home remedies could address. The girl ran to her mother's side immediately, small hands patting the woman's face with increasing desperation, calling, "Mama, Mama!" in a voice that cracked with terror she'd been holding back until they reached safety. Kieran moved into action before conscious thought could intervene, crossing the small space in 3 strides and pressing fingers to the woman's neck to find a pulse that fluttered weak and rapid beneath skin that burned like fire against his touch. Professional training he'd acquired through necessity rather than medical school kicked in, his mind cataloging symptoms with detached precision, even as something very not detached twisted in his gut. The woman's lips carried a bluish tinge suggesting oxygen deprivation. Her breathing labored enough to indicate pneumonia or worse, and the fever raging through her body meant infection had reached the stage where minutes might matter more than hours. "How long has she been like this?" Kieran asked, pulling out his phone while scanning the apartment for medication bottles or medical information that might inform emergency responders about existing conditions or allergies. The girl pointed to a chipped clock on the wall that read 2:47 a.m., then held up small fingers in a gesture that took Kieran a moment to interpret. 3 hours of unconsciousness, while a 4-year-old tried to handle a medical crisis that would overwhelm most adults. The nightstand revealed an organization that spoke of desperate attempts to maintain control amid chaos. Bills stacked in careful piles, each marked with red stamps demanding payment. Medication bottles lined up by expiration date with most of them empty. Kieran spotted antibiotics prescribed 6 months prior, the label indicating the full course had never been completed, probably because the woman had stretched a 10-day supply across 2 months to save money for the next crisis. A calendar on the wall showed shifts marked in different colors, double and triple shifts clustered together in patterns that meant this woman worked herself to exhaustion, just to afford this decay-scented studio in a building that should have been demolished decades ago. The fury in Kieran's chest intensified as he dialed 911, his voice emerging steady and authoritative, despite the chaos of emotions he refused to examine closely. "I need an ambulance at 347 Cumming Street, 3rd floor, Studio 3B, he said, watching the child's face transform from terror to desperate hope that gutted him more effectively than any knife he'd ever faced. The dispatcher asked questions he answered with clinical precision, describing symptoms and vital signs while the girl clutched her mother's hand with both of her own, whispering promises that everything would be okay in a voice that suggested she'd been the adult in this relationship far longer than her 4 years should have required. Kieran knelt beside the bed, his expensive suit jacket brushing against worn linoleum that had been scrubbed clean despite impossibility of making it truly sanitary, and placed a hand on the child's shoulder with unexpected gentleness. "They're coming to help your mama," he said, and the girl turned to him with tears streaming down cheeks flushed from exertion and fear, small arms suddenly wrapping around his neck in embrace that froze every molecule in his body. The ambulance arrived within 7 minutes, but those minutes stretched into something resembling eternity as Kieran stayed kneeling beside the bed. The child, Ivy, he'd learned when she finally whispered her name against his shoulder, clinging to him with desperation that made breathing difficult for reasons that had nothing to do with the apartment's stifling air. He'd held dying men in back alleys, watched blood drain from faces of people who'd crossed the wrong families, but nothing in his carefully constructed criminal existence had prepared him for the weight of a terrified child, seeking comfort from a stranger who dealt in violence and silence. The paramedics burst through the door with equipment and efficiency, their practiced movements transforming the cramped space into emergency treatment center as they assessed the woman's condition with rapid-fire questions Kieran answered while consulting the medication bottles he'd gathered. Ivy refused to release her grip on him, even as the medical team worked, her small face buried against his chest, and Kieran found himself murmuring reassurances in a voice he didn't recognize as his own, gentle words about her mother being strong, about the helpers knowing exactly what to do, about everything turning out fine even though he had no authority to make such promises. "Severe pneumonia, possibly septic," one paramedic announced to his partner, and Kieran watched their expressions shift into that careful neutrality healthcare workers adopted when situations were critical, but they couldn't afford panic. They inserted an IV line with practiced efficiency, the woman's arm revealing track marks from previous medical interventions and bruises in various stages of healing that spoke of physical labor that broke down bodies designed for gentler treatment. Oxygen mask came next, then a rapid consultation about transport to Medical University Hospital, rather than the closer facility that wouldn't have resources for what they suspected was systemic infection, requiring aggressive intervention. "Is there a father in the picture? Other family we should notify?" The question came from the female paramedic, her eyes moving between Kieran's expensive clothes and the apartment's obvious poverty, with barely concealed curiosity about his presence here. Kieran looked at Ivy, who shook her head against his chest with tiny movement that communicated volumes about absence and abandonment, and he felt rage ignite alongside the unfamiliar protectiveness that had been building since the moment small hands had grabbed his wrist in the street. "Just me," he said, the lie emerging smooth as glass despite its complete fabrication, and he watched the paramedics exchange glances that suggested they'd heard similar stories countless times in this neighborhood. They didn't question his claim, too focused on stabilizing their patient for transport, and Kieran realized with dark clarity that he'd just inserted himself into a situation that would require explanations he couldn't provide, without exposing identities he'd spent years keeping separate from anything resembling normal human interaction. The descent down the fire escape with Ivy in his arms while paramedics maneuvered the stretcher through the building's narrow internal stairwell felt surreal, as though Kieran had stepped out of his actual life into some alternate reality where he carried frightened children and made promises about sick mothers to strangers. The pre-dawn air had shifted toward morning, humidity rising with the approaching sun, and Charleston's historic district was beginning to wake around them, delivery trucks rumbling over cobblestones, early shift workers heading toward the port, the city's dual nature becoming visible as wealth and poverty existed in uncomfortable proximity. Ivy's weight against his chest felt simultaneously insignificant and monumental, her small body trusting him with complete faith despite having known him less than an hour, and Kieran wondered what desperation looked like when it wore the face of a 4-year-old who'd learned that adults couldn't always be relied upon to wake up when called. The ambulance waited at the building's front entrance. Back doors opened to receive the stretcher that emerged moments later, carrying the woman whose name he still didn't know, and Kieran made a decision that he recognized even in the moment as potentially catastrophic to the carefully maintained boundaries of his existence. "I'm riding with them," he told the paramedics, climbing into the ambulance before they could protest. Ivy still wrapped around him like she'd grown roots into his ribcage. The female paramedic opened her mouth to object, probably about regulations regarding non-family members, but something in Kieran's expression made her reconsider, and she simply nodded before securing the stretcher and signaling her partner to start moving. The doors slammed shut. Siren began its urgent wail, and Kieran found himself in the back of an ambulance racing through Charleston's waking streets, while holding a child who'd somehow dismantled every defense he'd spent a decade constructing. The ride to the hospital passed in a blur of medical jargon and monitoring equipment, the woman's condition apparently stable enough for transport, but critical enough that the paramedics maintained constant vigilance over vitals that fluctuated with concerning irregularity. Ivy had finally released her death grip on Kieran's neck, but she kept one small hand fisted in his shirt while watching the medical team work on her mother, with eyes that had seen too much for someone whose entire existence could be measured in 4 years. Kieran found himself stroking her blonde curls automatically, the gesture foreign, but somehow natural, and he wondered distantly when exactly he'd become the kind of person who comforted traumatized children, instead of being the source of trauma others fled from. "What's her name?" he asked quietly, nodding toward the woman on the stretcher, and Ivy's voice emerged small but clear in response. "Mama's name is Celeste, like the stars. She says we're both named after sky things because that's where dreams live, and we should never stop dreaming even when things are hard." The child's matter-of-fact delivery of what was clearly a memorized phrase gutted Kieran more effectively than any violence he'd experienced, and he felt something crack in his chest that he'd believed had calcified beyond the possibility of breaking. The ambulance pulled into the hospital's emergency bay with a lurch that sent equipment rattling, and suddenly they were surrounded by a new team of medical professionals who descended on the stretcher with coordinated urgency that spoke of protocols perfected through repetition. Kieran climbed out with Ivy in his arms, following the controlled chaos into the hospital's fluorescent brightness, and he caught his reflection in glass doors that slid open automatically. A man in a blood-spotted designer suit carrying a child in a worn red dress, looking nothing like the enforcer who'd left that poker game hours ago, and everything like someone whose entire world had just been knocked off its axis by a collision he never saw coming. The emergency room's waiting area smelled of antiseptic and desperation, a combination Kieran had encountered before, but never while holding a small child who'd fallen asleep against his shoulder after exhaustion finally overwhelmed her adrenaline. He'd given the intake coordinator what little information he could fabricate, claiming to be a friend who'd found Celeste unconscious, carefully omitting details about fire escapes and pre-dawn encounters that would raise questions he couldn't answer, without exposing the reality of his presence in that neighborhood at that hour. The coordinator had looked skeptical, but accepted his vague explanations, more concerned with insurance information that Kieran had promised to handle personally, already calculating how to funnel money through legitimate channels that wouldn't trigger investigations into his actual sources of income. Dawn broke properly through the waiting room's large windows, painting everything in shades of gold that felt obscene given the circumstances, and Kieran watched Charleston wake up around him, while Ivy's small body grew heavier, with sleep's complete surrender. Other people filtered through the emergency department, a teenager with a skateboarding injury, an elderly man clutching his chest, a woman with a gash on her forehead, each one accompanied by family or friends who belonged in this space of crisis and comfort in ways Kieran decidedly did not. He'd spent years perfecting the art of invisibility, of moving through crowds without leaving impressions or memories, but sitting here with a sleeping child made anonymity impossible, and he felt exposed in ways that had nothing to do with criminal liability. A nurse approached after what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, her scrubs decorated with cartoon characters that suggested pediatric specialization, and her expression carried the careful neutrality medical professionals used when delivering news that required delicate handling. "Are you Ivy's father?" she asked, and Kieran felt the question like a punch despite its predictability, the casual assumption that he belonged to this child, highlighting the absurdity of a situation he'd somehow committed himself to, without conscious decision. He shook his head, preparing explanation, but Ivy stirred against his shoulder and murmured, "That's Kieran. He saved Mama," in a sleep-thick voice that made the nurse's expression soften with understanding. That was probably completely inaccurate. "Celeste is stable but critical," the nurse explained, kneeling to bring herself to Ivy's eye level, as the child woke more fully, rubbing small fists against eyes still puffy from tears she'd cried earlier. "She has pneumonia that's very serious, and she'll need to stay in the hospital for at least a week, maybe longer, depending on how she responds to antibiotics." The medical explanation continued with details about sepsis risk and respiratory support, but Kieran's mind had already moved to logistics. Who would care for Ivy during her mother's hospitalization? What would happen to their apartment if rent went unpaid? How would Celeste manage medical bills that would undoubtedly reach catastrophic levels, even with whatever minimal insurance she might have? Ivy's small hand found Kieran's again, her grip tight with renewed fear, and she looked up at him with those blue eyes that had somehow become his responsibility, without any formal agreement or legal standing. "Can Mama wake up now?" The question carried hope that shouldn't have survived the night's trauma, and Kieran felt his throat constrict with emotions he had no framework for processing. The nurse explained gently that Celeste was sleeping to help her body fight the infection, that she'd be able to see her Mama later today, once the doctors finished their treatments, and Ivy nodded with understanding that seemed far too mature for 4 years of existence. "Is there family we can call? Someone who can take care of Ivy while her mother recovers?" The nurse directed the question at Kieran, assumption clear that he would know the answer despite their lack of actual relationship, and he found himself meeting Ivy's gaze with silent question he had no right to ask. The child shook her head minutely, then whispered, "It's just us and Mama. Nobody else wants us," with such casual acceptance of abandonment that Kieran felt rage return, alongside the protectiveness that had been building throughout this impossible night. "She stays with me," Kieran said, the declaration emerging with finality that brooked no argument even as his rational mind screamed about the insanity of a Mafia enforcer taking responsibility for a traumatized 4-year-old he'd met less than 3 hours ago. The nurse's eyebrows rose slightly, professional mask slipping to reveal surprise, and Kieran could see her mental calculations about appropriateness and safety and whether this situation required intervention beyond medical care. He straightened his posture slightly, allowing some of the authority he wielded in very different contexts to shade his presence, and watched her decide that questioning him would create complications she didn't have time or energy to navigate. "I'll need contact information and identification," she said finally, producing paperwork that would create a paper trail Kieran normally avoided with religious dedication. But he accepted the clipboard without hesitation, because the alternative was Ivy being processed into a foster system that would separate her from her mother and likely cause more trauma than she'd already endured. He filled out forms with one hand while keeping the other around Ivy's small shoulders, using one of his legitimate business addresses and a phone number that actually reached him, but wasn't connected to his more questionable activities, creating a fiction of normalcy that felt more dangerous than any criminal operation he'd ever participated in. The nurse left with promises to update them on Celeste's condition and arrange a visit once the medical team completed their initial treatments, and Kieran found himself alone again with Ivy in the gradually filling waiting room. The child had retreated back into silence, her small body pressed against his side, and he could feel tremors running through her that spoke of delayed shock, finally catching up to adrenaline that had kept her functioning through the crisis. Morning light continued to strengthen through the windows, and Kieran realized with strange detachment that he'd crossed some invisible line during this night, that the person who'd walked into that poker game no longer existed in any meaningful sense. "Are you hungry?" he asked quietly, the question feeling absurdly domestic given everything else happening. But Ivy nodded against his shirt, and he felt relief at having a concrete problem to solve. The hospital cafeteria would be open by now, serving breakfast to staff and visitors who belonged in this world of healing and hope, and Kieran stood carefully with Ivy in his arms, her weight settling naturally against his hip, as though they'd practiced this hold countless times. He caught sight of them again in the hallway's reflective surfaces, the man who'd earned his reputation through calculated violence, and the child who'd somehow decided he was safe, despite having every reason to fear strangers, and something shifted in his chest that felt irreversible. The cafeteria occupied the hospital's ground floor, already bustling with early morning activity, as medical staff grabbed coffee between shifts, and family members sought comfort in food they probably couldn't taste through worry and exhaustion. Kieran navigated the space with Ivy clinging to him, aware of eyes tracking their progress with curiosity that felt invasive but understandable, given how completely they didn't match as a pair. He let Ivy choose what she wanted, pancakes and strawberries and orange juice that she gripped with both hands, and found a corner table that offered some privacy from the surrounding humanity pressing in on all sides. Watching Ivy eat with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned not to take meals for granted, Kieran felt the full weight of what he'd committed himself to settling across his shoulders like physical burden. He had no legal right to this child, no relationship to her mother beyond having found her unconscious, no experience with caring for anyone who couldn't defend themselves or navigate adult complexities independently. Everything about this situation violated the rules he'd established for surviving in Charleston's criminal underworld. Yet walking away felt as impossible as sprouting wings and flying from the hospital's rooftop. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Messages from associates wondering where he'd disappeared to. Questions about the poker game's aftermath that would require carefully constructed responses. Reminders of meetings scheduled for later today that now felt like obligations from someone else's life entirely. Kieran silenced the device without reading beyond the preview notifications, choosing instead to focus on Ivy's small face as she looked up at him with maple syrup on her chin and asked in a voice barely above a whisper, "Will you stay until Mama wakes up?" The question shouldn't have required consideration, but Kieran found himself understanding the enormity of what she was really asking, not just about today, but about all the days that might follow, about whether he would be another adult who disappeared when things got difficult. "I'll stay," he promised, and watched something in Ivy's expression ease slightly. Trust being rebuilt in increments so small they were almost imperceptible, but somehow monumental in their accumulation. She went back to her pancakes with renewed focus, and Kieran pulled out his phone to send careful messages postponing everything that could be postponed and delegating what couldn't, constructing excuses that wouldn't raise suspicions about his sudden unavailability. The morning stretched ahead with uncertainty that should have felt intolerable, but instead carried a strange clarity, as though the collision that had brought them together had knocked him onto a path he'd been avoiding, without realizing he'd been running from something that looked remarkably like salvation. A doctor appeared in the cafeteria doorway 2 hours later, her presence instantly recognizable by the authority she carried, and the exhaustion shadowing her features despite the early morning hour. She scanned the room until her eyes landed on Kieran and Ivy, and something in her expression softened as she approached their corner table, where pancake remnants had long since been cleared away and replaced by coloring sheets a kind volunteer had provided. Kieran stood automatically, Ivy climbing into his arms with the ease of familiarity that shouldn't have developed so quickly, and he found himself bracing for news that might shatter the fragile stability they'd constructed over breakfast. "Celeste is awake," the doctor said without preamble, her directness suggesting someone who understood that waiting for information was its own form of torture. "She's weak and will need extensive treatment, but she's stable enough for a brief visit if Ivy would like to see her." The child's entire body went rigid with hope against Kieran's chest, small hands clutching his shirt with renewed intensity, and he felt her heart hammering through the thin fabric of her worn red dress that had somehow become as familiar to him as his own expensive clothes. They followed the doctor through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and recycled air, past rooms containing other people's tragedies and triumphs, until they reached a door marked with Celeste's temporary designation in this bureaucratic system that reduced human beings to bed numbers and insurance codes. The doctor paused before entering, her hand on the door handle, and looked at Kieran with assessment that felt uncomfortably penetrating. "She's been asking about the man who saved her daughter," she said quietly, and Kieran understood this was both information and warning, that Celeste would have questions he couldn't answer honestly without exposing realities better left unexamined. The room beyond contained medical equipment humming with technological vigilance, monitors displaying vital signs that meant nothing to Ivy, but told Kieran more than he wanted to know about how close Celeste had come to dying. She lay propped against pillows that seemed to swallow her small frame, oxygen cannula running beneath her nose, IV lines connecting her to bags of antibiotics that dripped salvation one measured dose at a time. Her blonde hair had been pulled back from a face that still carried fever's flush, but no longer burned with the intensity that had terrified him in that cramped apartment, and her eyes, the same startling blue as her daughter's, tracked their entrance with awareness that had been completely absent hours before. "Mama!" Ivy's cry broke the room's clinical silence, and Kieran felt her struggle against his hold with desperate need to reach her mother, despite the medical equipment creating barriers between them. He approached the bed carefully, aware of the doctor hovering near the door, and nurses moving in the hallway beyond, and lowered Ivy onto the mattress beside Celeste, with gentleness that came from somewhere he didn't recognize in himself. Mother and daughter came together with the kind of reunion that made looking away feel necessary. But Kieran found himself unable to turn from the sight of Celeste's arms wrapping around Ivy with strength that shouldn't have been possible given her condition. "Thank you," Celeste whispered over Ivy's blonde curls, her voice hoarse from intubation and fever, but carrying weight that transcended the simple words. Her gaze met Kieran's across the small space separating them, and he saw intelligence there alongside the gratitude, questions forming behind exhaustion that would require answers he wasn't prepared to provide. "The nurses said you brought her here, that you stayed with her all night. I don't understand why a stranger would—" Her voice cracked, tears spilling over cheeks that had probably shed too many already, and Kieran felt something twist in his chest that made breathing difficult. "She found me when you wouldn't wake up," Kieran said, keeping his voice steady through effort that cost more than any poker game bluff he'd ever maintained. "I couldn't leave her alone." The explanation felt inadequate for decisions that had altered the trajectory of his entire existence. But Celeste nodded, as though it made perfect sense that her 4-year-old had approached a dangerous stranger in Charleston's pre-dawn streets, and somehow found the one person who would actually help, rather than exploit or ignore her desperate situation. Ivy had burrowed against her mother's side, small body finally relaxing after hours of tension that had kept her functioning through crisis, and Kieran watched Celeste stroke her daughter's hair with trembling fingers that spoke of weakness, battling fierce maternal love. "I tried so hard to stay awake," Celeste said, words emerging thick with guilt and shame that made Kieran's anger return full force, not at her, but at systems that forced mothers to choose between medical care and rent, between antibiotics and food, between their own survival and their children's immediate needs. The doctor cleared her throat from the doorway, professional intrusion into a moment that had become too intimate for the clinical setting, and announced that Celeste needed rest and continued monitoring before more extensive visiting could be allowed. Ivy's small face crumpled with protest, but Celeste whispered something in her ear that made her nod reluctantly, and Kieran found himself receiving the child back into his arms, like a package whose contents had become infinitely more precious and fragile than anything he'd ever been trusted to carry before. "I'll take care of her," Kieran said, the promise emerging without conscious thought, but feeling more binding than any oath he'd sworn to the families who controlled Charleston's criminal operations. Celeste's eyes widened slightly, confusion mixing with gratitude in her expression, and he could see her struggling to understand why this well-dressed stranger would make such commitments to people he had no connection to beyond a collision in the darkness. "Just focus on getting better. Don't worry about anything else." "I don't even know your name," Celeste said, and Kieran heard the subtext beneath the statement, that she was entrusting her daughter to someone who remained essentially anonymous, despite having already proven himself in ways that defied logical assessment. He hesitated, aware that names created trails, and trails led to questions he couldn't afford. But Ivy's weight in his arms, and Celeste's vulnerable trust made deception feel more dangerous than exposure. "Kieran Drake," he said, offering the name he used in legitimate business contexts rather than the various aliases he employed in darker transactions, and watched Celeste repeat it silently, as though memorizing something essential. The doctor was making impatient noises about rest and recovery protocols, but Celeste reached out one trembling hand toward Kieran, and he stepped close enough that she could grasp his wrist with fingers that barely had strength to maintain contact. "Thank you for being the miracle I've been praying for," she whispered, and Kieran felt the words settle over him like a mantle he had no idea how to wear. They left her sleeping under medical supervision that would continue monitoring the infection's response to aggressive treatment, and Kieran carried Ivy back through the hospital's corridors while she maintained silence that felt heavier than her earlier fear. The morning had progressed into full day, sunlight streaming through windows with brightness that seemed inappropriate for the exhaustion dragging at him, and Kieran realized he hadn't slept in over 24 hours, not since before the poker game that now felt like it had occurred in someone else's lifetime entirely. "Where do we go now?" Ivy asked as they reached the hospital's main entrance, her small voice carrying confusion that mirrored his own uncertainty about the logistics of caring for a child when his entire existence was structured around solitude and secrecy. Kieran's penthouse apartment downtown contained nothing remotely suitable for a 4-year-old. His refrigerator stocked primarily with bourbon and the occasional takeout container, his schedule built around meetings and operations that couldn't accommodate playground supervision or bedtime routines. But the alternative, returning Ivy to that decaying apartment building where she'd spent hours trying to wake an unconscious mother, felt impossible. "We'll figure it out," he said, carrying her toward his car in the parking garage, while his mind raced through problems that couldn't be solved with money or violence or the carefully cultivated connections he'd spent years developing. Ivy's head settled against his shoulder with trust that felt simultaneously like a gift and a burden too heavy to bear, and Kieran wondered when exactly he'd become the kind of person who accepted responsibility for innocent lives instead of being the threat those lives needed protecting from. Kieran's penthouse overlooked Charleston Harbor from the 23rd floor, all glass and steel and minimalist design that reflected the emptiness he'd cultivated as both aesthetic and lifestyle choice. Ivy stood in the center of the living room looking impossibly small against the space's cold sophistication, her worn red dress and scuffed shoes creating contrast that felt like an indictment of everything Kieran had built, while people like Celeste struggled in buildings held together by hope and desperation. The afternoon sun painted geometric patterns across marble floors that had never known the sound of children's footsteps, and Kieran felt the full absurdity of his situation crash over him as he realized he had no idea how to care for a traumatized 4-year-old in an environment designed specifically to avoid human connection. "Are you rich?" Ivy asked with the directness only children could manage, her eyes scanning the floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive furniture with assessment that suggested she understood the wealth disparity between her world and his. Kieran felt discomfort crawl up his spine at the question's implications, at being forced to acknowledge privilege he'd taken for granted, while Celeste worked multiple shifts to afford medicine she couldn't complete. "I have money," he said carefully, the understatement so vast it felt obscene, and watched Ivy nod with the kind of matter-of-fact acceptance that children in poverty learned early, that some people had everything, while others had nothing, and the distribution followed rules that made no sense. He ordered groceries and children's clothing through services he'd never used before, describing Ivy's size to personal shoppers, who probably wondered why a man who lived in Charleston's most exclusive building suddenly needed girls' items delivered urgently. The requests felt foreign on his tongue, toothbrush and pajamas and food that 4-year-olds would actually eat, rather than the protein shakes and black coffee that constituted his usual nutrition. Ivy had discovered the floor-to-ceiling windows and stood pressed against the glass, watching boats move through the harbor far below, her small handprints leaving marks on surfaces Kieran's cleaning service kept pristine, but he found himself unwilling to tell her to stop touching things in a space that suddenly felt too sterile for actual living. His phone kept vibrating with messages he continued to ignore, associates and contacts wondering about his absence from scheduled meetings and whether the poker game's violence had created complications requiring his particular expertise. Kieran knew his disappearance would generate speculation and questions he'd eventually need to address, but the thought of returning to that existence while Ivy needed stability felt impossible in ways he couldn't articulate even to himself. He was standing at a crossroads he hadn't known existed, forced to choose between the life he'd built through calculated violence and something else entirely that terrified him more than any physical threat he'd ever faced. The deliveries arrived in waves throughout the afternoon. Bags of groceries that included things Kieran had never purchased in his life, clothing in sizes he'd guessed at, toys and books the personal shopper had included without being asked. Ivy watched the parade of packages with wide eyes, and when Kieran opened a bag containing stuffed animals and coloring books, her small face crumpled with emotions that seemed too large for her body to contain. "These are for me?" she whispered, touching a plush rabbit with the kind of reverence usually reserved for holy relics. And Kieran felt his throat constrict at the realization that this child had probably never received a gift simply because someone thought she deserved kindness. He made dinner with Ivy's help, the process chaotic and messy in ways that would have been unthinkable in his usual controlled existence, and found himself laughing when she insisted on adding more cheese to pasta that was already drowning in dairy products. They ate at the dining table he'd purchased for appearances but rarely used, and Kieran discovered that shared meals tasted different when consumed with someone whose presence demanded engagement rather than the solitary efficiency he'd perfected. Ivy told him about her preschool and her best friend who'd moved away last month, and how her mama sang songs about stars before bedtime, each detail building a picture of lives lived in the margins, while people like him moved through the world insulated from such struggles by money that solved problems they'd never have to face. Bath time became an exercise in improvisation that left the bathroom looking like a small tsunami had struck, and Kieran found himself kneeling on expensive tile soaking wet, while Ivy splashed with joy that seemed miraculous given everything she'd endured in the past 24 hours. He dried her carefully with towels softer than anything she'd probably experienced, helped her into new pajamas that still had tags attached, and carried her to the guest bedroom that had never housed actual guests because Kieran didn't do hospitality, or connection, or anything resembling normal human relationships. The bed was too large for someone so small, but Ivy climbed into the center and looked up at him with eyes that carried questions she was too young to articulate about impermanence, and whether tomorrow would bring more disappointment. "Will you stay until I sleep?" she asked, echoing her earlier question at the hospital, and Kieran settled into the chair beside the bed, with the understanding that he was making promises that extended far beyond a single night. He'd never sung lullabies or told bedtime stories or engaged in any of the parenting rituals that normal people navigated without conscious thought, but Ivy's expectant face demanded he try. The song that emerged came from somewhere deep in his memory, something his own mother had sung before she'd disappeared from his life, before foster care and juvenile detention, and the slow descent into Charleston's criminal underworld had transformed him into someone who hurt people for money. His voice cracked on the melody he hadn't remembered knowing, and Ivy's eyes drifted closed with the kind of trust that felt sacred, her small hand still clutching the plush rabbit like a talisman against darkness that had already touched her far too intimately. Kieran watched her breathing even out into sleep's surrender, and he felt something fundamental shift in his chest, recognition that he'd been moving through life as though emotions were weaknesses to be excised, rather than essential components of being fully human. The child sleeping in his guest room had somehow accomplished what years of violence and isolation couldn't. She'd reminded him that he was capable of caring about something beyond his own survival and the accumulation of power in Charleston's criminal hierarchy. He retreated to his bedroom after ensuring Ivy was deeply asleep, exhaustion finally catching up to adrenaline that had sustained him through an impossibly long day. But sleep felt impossible despite his body's demands, his mind replaying moments from the past 24 hours like a film he couldn't stop watching. Celeste's face haunted him particularly, the gratitude mixed with confusion in her expression when she'd woken to find her daughter safe, the vulnerability she'd shown despite obvious strength that had kept her fighting long past when most people would have surrendered. He'd encountered countless people in his criminal work, but none had affected him the way this woman did, this struggling mother who'd worked herself into septic pneumonia trying to provide for a child who deserved so much more than the world was offering. The next morning arrived too early, dawn light streaming through windows that faced east over the harbor, and Kieran woke to find Ivy standing beside his bed, staring at him with the intensity only 4-year-olds could manage. "Is Mama okay?" she asked, the question suggesting she'd been awake for a while, worrying about things children shouldn't have to worry about. And Kieran felt guilt join the complex mix of emotions he was still learning to navigate. He called the hospital before breakfast, speaking with nurses who reported Celeste's condition as improving, but still critical, and relayed the information to Ivy, while watching relief transform her small features. They visited the hospital again that afternoon, Ivy carrying a drawing she'd made using supplies from the packages delivered yesterday. a picture of 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a sun that blazed with yellow crayon enthusiasm. Celeste was sitting up when they arrived, color returning to her cheeks and strength evident in movements that had been trembling weakness the day before. She held Ivy for long minutes, breathing in her daughter's scent, like it was oxygen more essential than what flowed through the cannula beneath her nose. And when she looked up at Kieran, her eyes carried questions that demanded answers he wasn't sure how to provide. "How long can you keep her?" Celeste asked, when Ivy became absorbed in arranging the stuffed animals Kieran had brought from the penthouse, her voice low with the kind of desperation that came from understanding the precariousness of her situation. Medical bills were already accumulating at rates that would bankrupt someone who'd been barely surviving before this crisis. Her job at the hotel likely gone after days of unexplained absence, the apartment's rent coming due with no money to cover it. Kieran saw calculations happening behind her eyes, the mathematics of poverty where every variable pointed toward catastrophe and solutions required miracles she had no right to expect from a stranger who'd already done more than anyone could reasonably ask. "As long as necessary," Kieran said, and watched shock replace resignation in Celeste's expression. He'd spent the previous evening researching options while Ivy slept, his mind approaching the problem with the same strategic thinking he applied to criminal operations. But every legitimate avenue led to bureaucracies that would separate mother and daughter or create dependencies that stripped Celeste of the dignity she clearly valued above charity. "I have resources, and I'd like to help beyond just temporary childcare. Your medical bills, the apartment, whatever you need to get stable." "I can't accept that," Celeste said immediately, pride evident in the set of her jaw, despite the weakness that kept her confined to a hospital bed. "I'm not looking for a savior, and I won't be someone's charity project." The words carried steel beneath their exhaustion, and Kieran felt respect join the complicated feelings developing toward this woman who refused rescue even when drowning. "I appreciate everything you've done for Ivy, but I need to stand on my own feet. I need to know I'm providing for my daughter through my own work, not someone else's pity." Kieran understood the need for agency, had felt it himself during his own struggles before finding his place in Charleston's criminal world, but watching Celeste try to negotiate from a position of complete powerlessness made anger return alongside the protectiveness he was still learning to acknowledge. "What if it wasn't charity?" he asked, mind already formulating plans that straddled the line between legitimate business and the operations that actually funded his lifestyle. "I own several restaurants in the historic district. One of them needs a manager, someone who understands hospitality and can handle the complexity of running a high-end establishment. It's a real job with real responsibilities and competitive salary." The offer was partially fabricated. The restaurant existed but currently had perfectly competent management, but Kieran could make the fiction reality with a few phone calls that would restructure operations to accommodate his sudden need for personnel changes. Celeste's eyes narrowed with suspicion that suggested she understood jobs didn't simply materialize for women who'd been unconscious days before, but he could see her weighing pride against pragmatism, the need to provide for Ivy against the reality that she had no other options currently available. "Why would you do this?" she asked, the question carrying weight beyond its simple construction, and Kieran found himself without answer that wouldn't reveal too much about the transformation happening beneath his carefully maintained surface. "Because Ivy deserves stability, and you've clearly been fighting for that alone for too long," he said finally, the truth feeling dangerous but necessary in ways he couldn't quite articulate. "Let someone help carry the weight for a while. Accept the job, focus on recovering, and we can figure out the rest as we go." Celeste studied him with intensity that made Kieran feel exposed, despite years of perfecting masks that revealed nothing, and he wondered what she saw when she looked at him, whether she recognized the violence he carried beneath expensive clothes, or whether Ivy's trust had created illusions about his essential nature. Celeste was released from the hospital after 8 days of aggressive antibiotic treatment, her body still weak, but no longer actively fighting infections that had nearly killed her. Kieran arranged transportation, despite her protests about needing to manage things herself, and he watched something in her expression shift when the car pulled up to his building, rather than returning toward the neighborhood where her apartment stood empty and probably already re-rented, given her inability to pay rent during hospitalization. "I can't stay here," she said, tension evident in shoulders that straightened despite exhaustion. But Ivy was already unbuckling her seatbelt with excitement about showing Mama the harbor views and the stuffed rabbit that slept in her new bed. "You need somewhere safe to recover before starting work," Kieran said, keeping his voice neutral despite the nervous energy thrumming through him at the prospect of Celeste seeing how he lived. of her presence in spaces he'd designed specifically to avoid intimacy or connection. The guest room is available, and Ivy's already settled into a routine here. Consider it temporary housing until you're strong enough to find your own place. The careful casualness of his tone suggested this was simple practicality rather than the calculated restructuring of his entire existence around their needs. But Celeste's sharp gaze suggested she wasn't fooled by his attempts at nonchalance. The penthouse felt different with Celeste's presence filling spaces that had been empty, despite expensive furniture and carefully curated art. She moved through rooms with the assessment of someone trained in hospitality management, her eyes catching details that revealed more about Kieran than he'd intended. The lack of personal photographs or mementos, the kitchen that showed minimal use despite high-end appliances, the overall aesthetic that prioritized appearance over actual living. Ivy gave an enthusiastic tour that highlighted her favorite discovery spots, and the window seat where she watched boats while eating breakfast. And Kieran found himself seeing his home through their eyes, recognizing how the space reflected isolation he'd mistaken for preference rather than the defense mechanism it actually represented. Settling into cohabitation required adjustments that felt monumental for someone who'd lived alone by choice for the past decade. Celeste insisted on contributing to household tasks despite her weakness, her need for independence manifesting in small ways that Kieran learned not to challenge directly. She cooked meals that transformed his sterile kitchen into something resembling an actual home, the sense of dinner preparation replacing the usual silence with evidence of human habitation. Ivy thrived on having her mother nearby, the tension that had shadowed her during Celeste's hospitalization dissipating into the kind of childhood exuberance that filled the penthouse with laughter and the constant chatter of 4-year-old observations about everything from cloud shapes to why boats floated. Kieran found himself adjusting his schedule to accommodate their routines, declining meetings that would keep him out past Ivy's bedtime, and restructuring operations to maintain more regular hours than his previous nocturnal existence had required. Associates noticed the changes with curiosity that graduated toward suspicion, questions about his availability becoming pointed enough that he recognized the need to address speculation before it evolved into problems he couldn't control. His reputation had been built on reliability and consistent availability for the families who relied on his services, and deviations from established patterns created vulnerabilities in Charleston's criminal ecosystem where weakness invited exploitation. The restaurant job became real through a series of phone calls that resulted in the previous manager accepting a generous promotion to oversee multiple properties while Celeste took over the flagship location in the historic district. She started slowly, working half-days while her strength returned, and Kieran watched from careful distance as she transformed operations with efficiency that suggested his invented job offer had actually identified genuine talent. The staff responded to her leadership with respect that couldn't be manufactured, and customer satisfaction metrics improved within weeks of her taking control, validating what had begun as a convenient fiction, but revealed itself as legitimate business decision. Evenings developed their own rhythm that felt dangerously domestic, Celeste and Kieran sharing wine after Ivy went to sleep, conversations ranging from restaurant operations to childhood memories, to careful avoidance of topics that would expose too much about his actual sources of income. He told her he worked in import-export with vague references to shipping and logistics that weren't technically lies, but obscured the criminal nature of goods he actually moved through Charleston's port. Celeste seemed to sense boundaries he wasn't ready to cross, her intelligence evident in questions she didn't ask about business that kept him out at odd hours, or associates who called with urgency that suggested life-or-death stakes beyond legitimate commerce. The first time their hands touched reaching for the same wine glass felt electric in ways Kieran hadn't experienced since before cynicism had calcified his capacity for genuine connection. Celeste pulled back immediately, professional distance reasserting itself, but something in her eyes suggested she'd felt it too, the current running between them that transcended gratitude or convenience, or any of the practical reasons that justified their continued proximity. Kieran found himself hyper-aware of her presence in ways that disrupted concentration he relied on for survival, her laugh from another room capable of derailing thoughts about operations that required absolute focus to execute without catastrophic consequences. Ivy noticed the tension before either adult acknowledged it, her 4-year-old observations cutting through pretense with characteristic directness. "Do you like Mama?" she asked Kieran one morning while they made pancakes together, Celeste still sleeping after a late shift at the restaurant, and he felt the question land with weight, far exceeding its simple construction. "Of course I like her," he said carefully, aware he was navigating territory more dangerous than any criminal negotiation he'd handled. But Ivy shook her head with the impatience children showed adults who deliberately misunderstood obvious questions. "No, like her. The way people do in movies before they kiss," she clarified. And Kieran found himself without response that wouldn't either lie to her or admit feelings he wasn't ready to examine closely. The moment crystallized a week later during dinner when Celeste laughed at something Ivy said, and Kieran felt his chest constrict with the realization that he'd fallen for this woman without conscious decision or strategic planning that usually governed his choices. She was brilliant and fierce and maintained dignity despite circumstances that would have broken someone with less strength, and every conversation revealed depth he wanted to explore, despite knowing that real intimacy would require honesty about his criminal involvement that could destroy everything they'd built together. The awareness sat heavy in his stomach alongside the excellent pasta Celeste had prepared, and he recognized that he was approaching a reckoning that would force him to choose between the life he'd constructed and the family that had somehow formed around him without permission or warning. His phone buzzed during dessert with a message that made his blood run cold. A rival organization had started asking questions about his recent unavailability, speculation about whether personal distractions had made him vulnerable to pressure or compromise. The text came from his most trusted associate, warning encoded in language that appeared innocuous, but carried clear threat about situations developing that required his immediate attention. Kieran excused himself to the balcony, mind already calculating risks and responses, but Celeste followed him outside, with the kind of determination that suggested she'd noticed more than he'd realized about his carefully compartmentalized existence. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked, her voice carrying the steel he'd heard when she'd refused his charity in the hospital. And Kieran felt the foundations he'd built between his two lives beginning to crack under pressure that had been building since the moment Ivy had collided with him in Charleston's pre-dawn darkness. The harbor stretched out below them, boats moving through water that reflected city lights, and he recognized that he stood at a precipice where honesty and continued deception both carried consequences he couldn't fully predict. "My work is complicated," he said finally, the understatement so vast it felt like mockery, but Celeste's sharp gaze suggested she understood the evasion for what it was, confirmation that the danger she'd sensed beneath his surface was real rather than paranoia. "I'm not naive," Celeste said, stepping closer with the kind of courage that had kept her fighting through poverty and illness for Ivy's sake. "I know people don't accumulate this kind of wealth through entirely legal means in Charleston, not at your age without family connections you've never mentioned. I've been pretending I don't see the signs, because what you've done for us matters more than what I suspect about how you afford it." The admission hung between them alongside the humid night air, and Kieran felt relief alongside new fear, that she'd seen past his carefully maintained facade, but might not be able to live with the reality once fully exposed. "There are things about my life that could put you and Ivy in danger if the wrong people decided to use you as leverage," Kieran said, forcing himself to meet her eyes, despite the shame curling in his gut, at admitting he'd brought threat into their lives alongside protection and stability he'd provided. "I'm trying to transition away from those connections, but that process takes time and creates its own risks. I need you to trust that I would never deliberately endanger you, but I also can't promise complete safety while I'm still tied to operations that don't resolve cleanly." Celeste studied him for a long moment, the kind of assessment she probably used when evaluating whether restaurant situations required intervention or could be left to resolve organically, and Kieran held himself still under her scrutiny, despite the urge to explain or justify or defend choices that had seemed necessary before two blonde women had crashed into his existence and revealed everything he'd been missing while pretending isolation was strength. "I trust you," she said finally, her hand reaching out to rest on his forearm, with touch that felt like absolution he didn't deserve. "Not because I'm foolish or desperate, but because your actions toward Ivy and me have been consistently protective and generous when you could have walked away a dozen times. Whatever darkness you're involved in, I don't think it defines who you actually are." The kiss happened without conscious decision, Kieran closing the distance between them, before rational thought could intervene with all the reasons why complicating their situation with romance was catastrophically stupid. Celeste's lips were soft against his, her small gasp of surprise melting into response that suggested she'd been fighting the same attraction he had, and for a moment, the world reduced to sensation and connection that transcended the practical foundations their relationship had been built on. When they separated, both breathless, Kieran saw his own confusion and desire reflected in her expression, and he recognized that they'd crossed into territory that made retreat impossible, even if circumstances demanded it. "This changes things," Celeste whispered, her hand still resting on his chest, where she could probably feel his heart hammering with combination of arousal and terror at the vulnerability he'd just exposed. "It does," Kieran agreed, his thumb tracing her jawline with gentleness that contradicted the violence those same hands had inflicted in service of Charleston's criminal families. "But I don't want to pretend there's nothing between us when clearly there is. I don't know how to navigate this, any of this, but I want to try if you're willing to accept the complications that come with my life." The admission felt like standing naked under interrogation lights, but Celeste's small smile suggested she understood the magnitude of what he was offering despite his inability to articulate it elegantly. They stood on the balcony watching the harbor until Ivy's voice called from inside, asking if they were done with boring adult talking, and the moment broke into laughter that felt like release from tension neither had fully acknowledged carrying. Returning inside to find Ivy surrounded by art supplies she'd apparently discovered in Kieran's rarely used office, they exchanged glances that carried new weight alongside the easy domesticity they'd developed over weeks of cohabitation. Whatever they were becoming, family, partnership, something without clear definition, felt simultaneously fragile and inevitable, and Kieran recognized that protecting it would require confronting dangers he'd been avoiding since the text message had arrived during dinner, threatening to expose exactly how complicated his life actually was. The threat materialized 3 days after the balcony kiss, arriving in the form of a black sedan that pulled up outside the restaurant during Celeste's evening shift with occupants whose presence made Kieran's security instincts scream warnings he'd learned to trust through years of surviving Charleston's criminal landscape. His associate called immediately, voice tight with tension that communicated danger before words could specify details, and Kieran was already moving toward his car while issuing instructions to protect Celeste and evacuate the restaurant through back entrances that existed specifically for situations where front doors became compromised. The Volkov family had been encroaching on port operations for months, their ambitions in conflict with established territories that families like the ones Kieran served had controlled for generations. Someone had apparently decided that Kieran's recent distraction made him vulnerable leverage point, and the sedan's presence outside his restaurant represented message about how easily they could reach people he cared about if he didn't accommodate their expansion plans. Rage joined the fear coursing through his veins as he navigated evening traffic with precision that bordered on reckless, his mind calculating responses that ranged from negotiation to violence. He arrived to find the restaurant already locked down, his security team having implemented protocols with efficiency that justified the money he paid for their discretion and competence. Celeste stood in the kitchen surrounded by staff who'd been trained for exactly this scenario, her face pale but composed in ways that suggested she understood the danger was real, rather than theoretical. "They asked for you by name," she said when Kieran reached her side, and he heard the tremor beneath her controlled tone that spoke of fear she was fighting to contain. "Said they wanted to discuss business opportunities and would wait outside until you arrived to have the conversation," Celeste continued, and the casual phrasing couldn't disguise the threat implicit in armed men appearing at his legitimate business. Kieran felt the careful separation he'd maintained between his two lives collapsing under pressure that had always been inevitable once he'd allowed himself to care about people who could be used against him. He made calls while his security team maintained perimeter watch, reaching out to contacts who owed him favors or feared his reputation enough to provide information without asking questions that would require answers he couldn't give. The Volkov situation was worse than he'd realized. They'd been systematically targeting associates in his network, applying pressure designed to isolate him from support structures that had kept him safe through years of navigating Charleston's criminal ecosystem. His relationship with Celeste and Ivy had apparently been identified as his most significant vulnerability, and the sedan outside represented opening move in a campaign that wouldn't end with simple intimidation. "I need to get you and Ivy somewhere safe," Kieran said, his hand finding Celeste's with touch that grounded him despite the chaos of contingencies spinning through his mind. "There's a property outside the city that's secure, and off any records that could lead them to you." Celeste shook her head with determination that would have been admirable if circumstances weren't so urgent, the steel in her expression reminding him why he'd fallen for this woman who refused to be diminished by anything life threw at her. "Running makes us look weak, and it doesn't solve the actual problem of people threatening us," she said, stepping closer with courage that made his chest tighten. "This isn't your world," Kieran countered, the words emerging harsher than intended, but she didn't flinch from his intensity. "It became my world when I accepted your help and fell for a man whose business involves armed strangers showing up at restaurants," Celeste said, the casual acknowledgement of feelings they'd barely begun exploring hitting him like physical impact. "So, instead of hiding, tell me what we're actually dealing with, and how we fix it without more violence that could blow back on any of us." Her practical approach to crisis that would have sent most people into panic reminded Kieran exactly why she'd survived years of poverty that broke stronger people. The confrontation with the Volkov representatives happened in the restaurant's private dining room an hour later, Kieran having sent Celeste home with security escort, despite her protests about wanting to stay. 3 men sat across the table with the kind of casual menace that came from never having faced real consequences for violence they'd inflicted. And their leader, a man who introduced himself simply as Pavel, smiled with predatory amusement that made Kieran's hands curl into fists beneath the table. "We've been watching you, Drake," Pavel said, accent thick with Eastern European origins that matched intelligence reports about the Volkov family's connections to organizations that made Charleston's established families look like amateur operations. "Noticed you've gotten soft, playing house with the pretty blonde and her daughter." The casual mention of Celeste and Ivy sent rage spiking through Kieran's veins. Confirmation they'd been surveilled closely enough for these men to know intimate details about his personal life. "We're expanding operations in Charleston, and we need someone with your connections to facilitate the transition smoothly," Pavel continued, leaning back in his chair with confidence that suggested he'd already calculated all possible responses and found them manageable. "You help us establish distribution networks through the port. We make sure nothing unfortunate happens to your new family." The threat was phrased as business proposition, but the underlying message was clear: cooperate or watch people he cared about suffer consequences of his refusal. Kieran had negotiated with criminals his entire adult life, understood the calculus of power and fear that governed interactions in Charleston's underworld, but sitting across from men who'd threatened his family changed every equation he'd previously used to navigate such situations. "You've made a miscalculation," he said, voice carrying the kind of cold certainty that had earned his reputation for resolving disputes without unnecessary bloodshed. "I'm not the leverage point you think I am, and threatening civilians crosses lines that will unite families who normally compete." Pavel's smile widened with amusement that suggested he'd anticipated exactly this response and found it entertaining rather than concerning, his fingers drumming against the table in rhythm that felt deliberately designed to irritate. "The families you work for are dinosaurs waiting for extinction, Drake. New organizations with international connections are taking over operations in every major port city, and Charleston won't be exception." His casual dismissal of established power structures revealed either dangerous naivety or backing substantial enough to make such confidence justified. "You have 48 hours to decide whether you're obstacle or asset," Pavel said, standing with his associates in coordinated movement that suggested military training underlying their criminal operations. "After that, we start applying pressure in ways you won't be able to protect against, no matter how many security teams you hire." The men left through the restaurant's front entrance with the kind of bold visibility that communicated they had no fear of consequences, and Kieran sat in the empty dining room, feeling walls closing in around the life he'd been trying to build. His phone rang before he could fully process the implications of the ultimatum, and his most trusted associate's voice carried urgency that made his stomach drop even before words confirmed his worst fears. "They hit 3 more of our operations tonight while you were in that meeting. Warehouse fire on the port, 2 street dealers hospitalized, and someone spray-painted threats on the wall outside your penthouse building." The coordinated attacks demonstrated resources and planning that went beyond typical turf disputes, and Kieran realized he was facing organization with capabilities that exceeded anything Charleston's local families could match. He drove home through streets that suddenly felt hostile, hyper-aware of every car that followed too closely or lingered too long at intersections, his mind racing through scenarios that all ended with Celeste and Ivy caught in crossfire they'd never asked to be part of. The penthouse felt different when he entered. No longer sanctuary, but target marked by spray paint downstairs that building security was probably already removing, evidence of violation that couldn't be so easily erased from his consciousness. Celeste waited in the living room despite the late hour, Ivy asleep in the guest room, and her expression told him she'd already heard about the attacks through the network of restaurant staff who had connections throughout Charleston's service industry. "Tell me everything," she said, patting the couch beside her with gesture that invited confession rather than demanded it, and Kieran found himself doing exactly that, explaining the full extent of his criminal involvement. The families he worked for, the operations he facilitated, the violence he'd participated in or orchestrated throughout his years in Charleston's underworld. The words came easier than expected, relief mixing with shame as he watched her face process revelations that should have sent her running, but instead seemed to solidify her resolve to face whatever came next together. Dawn found Kieran in his office, making calls to every contact he'd cultivated over a decade of navigating Charleston's criminal ecosystem, calling in favors and making promises that would cost him significantly if he survived long enough to fulfill them. The established families were initially skeptical about the Volkov threat, dismissing his warnings as overreaction to routine intimidation tactics. But the warehouse fire and coordinated attacks had gotten their attention in ways his words alone couldn't. By mid-morning, he'd assembled an emergency meeting with representatives from the 3 major organizations that controlled Charleston's port operations, their willingness to convene on short notice indicating they recognized the existential threat posed by outside organizations, with resources that dwarfed their local operations. The meeting happened in a private room at one of the oldest hotels in the historic district, neutral territory where business had been conducted for generations before any of them were born. Kieran presented evidence his associates had gathered, documentation of Volkov operations in other cities, financial trails showing connections to international criminal networks, testimony from informants about expansion plans that would eliminate local families entirely, rather than negotiate coexistence. The men around the table listened with expressions that shifted from skepticism to concern as the scope of the threat became clear through data that couldn't be dismissed as paranoia. "They used my family as leverage to get my attention," Kieran said, and he saw understanding dawn in eyes that belonged to men who'd built empires on understanding exactly how pressure worked in their world. "That means they've done research on all of us, identified vulnerabilities they'll exploit systematically until we either capitulate or get destroyed fighting back individually." The strategic assessment resonated with people who'd survived decades in business, where weakness invited annihilation, and Kieran watched the dynamics in the room shift as former competitors recognized the need for unprecedented cooperation. The plan that emerged over hours of tense negotiation involved pooling resources in ways that violated every territorial instinct these men had honed over lifetimes of protecting what they'd built. They would present united front to the Volkov family, making clear that expansion in Charleston would require going through organizations with deeper roots and better local connections than any outside group could match. Kieran would be the primary negotiator given his existing contact with Pavel, but he'd have backing of families whose combined resources made his position significantly stronger than when he'd faced the Volkov representatives alone. Celeste was waiting when he returned to the penthouse that afternoon, her expression carrying determination that made his chest tighten with emotions he was still learning to navigate. "Ivy's at a play date with one of her preschool friends, supervised by 3 of your security people who are probably terrifying the other parents," she said, and despite the tension, he felt his lips twitch toward smile at the image. "I need to know what you decided, and I need you to be honest about the risks we're facing." He told her about the alliance he'd formed, the negotiation that would happen the following day, the possibility that despite united front, the Volkov family might decide Charleston was worth fighting for, rather than finding easier targets in cities with less organized resistance. Celeste listened with the focus she brought to restaurant operations, processing information without the panic that would have been justified given the stakes involved. "What happens to us if this goes wrong?" she asked, and Kieran appreciated that she said us, rather than separating herself and Ivy from consequences of his choices. "I've arranged contingencies, new identities, accounts they can't trace, property in cities where you could start over if I don't survive the fallout," Kieran said, the words tasting like ash because planning for their future without him. Forced acknowledgement of mortality he usually avoided contemplating. "But I need you to promise me that if things go sideways, you'll take Ivy and disappear without looking back." Celeste's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall, her hand reaching for his with grip that communicated everything words couldn't articulate about fear and love, and the impossibility of the situation they'd found themselves in. "I'm not losing you," she said with fierce certainty that made him believe for a moment that willpower alone could determine outcomes in a world where violence often made such determinations instead. "We didn't survive everything we've been through just to be torn apart by criminals who think intimidation gives them power over people's lives." Her refusal to accept defeat reminded Kieran why he'd fallen for this woman who faced impossible odds with courage that shamed his years of cynical detachment, and he pulled her close with desperate need to memorize how she felt in his arms, in case the coming days robbed him of the opportunity. They made love that night with intensity born of fear and defiance, bodies communicating what words couldn't capture about the connection that had formed between them, despite every practical reason it shouldn't exist. Afterward, lying tangled together while Charleston's lights painted patterns across the ceiling, Kieran felt peace that had eluded him his entire adult life. "I love you," he said, the words emerging easier than expected, despite never having spoken them to anyone since childhood, had taught him that love was liability rather than strength. "I love you too," Celeste whispered against his chest, and Kieran closed his eyes against tears that threatened to fall. The negotiation with Pavel happened in the same private dining room where threats had been delivered 2 days prior, but this time Kieran arrived with representatives from Charleston's 3 major families, flanking him like living proof that he wasn't isolated vulnerability they could exploit. Pavel's expression shifted minutely when he saw the assembled power, surprise quickly masked by professional neutrality that suggested he'd anticipated this possibility and prepared contingencies. The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours, tension thick enough that Kieran could taste it alongside the coffee that went cold in cups no one actually drank from. The Volkov family wanted port access for shipments that would flow through Charleston to distribution networks throughout the Southeast, operations that would generate millions in revenue annually, and required cooperation from people who currently controlled those channels. In exchange for facilitating their expansion, they offered percentages that would make everyone at the table significantly wealthier, while maintaining existing territorial boundaries for other operations. It was actually a reasonable proposition dressed in the threats that had preceded it, and Kieran watched the other men calculate whether profit outweighed the risk of doing business with organization that had demonstrated willingness to use violence as opening negotiation tactic. "We need guarantees," Kieran said, speaking for the group with authority they'd granted him through the alliance he'd forged. "No retaliation for the resistance you've encountered, no targeting of families or civilians, and clear boundaries about which operations remain under local control versus joint ventures." Pavel nodded with the kind of easy agreement that made Kieran's instincts scream warnings about concessions that came too smoothly. But the other men seemed satisfied with terms that preserved their power while opening new revenue streams. The deal was structured over the following week with lawyers who specialized in creating contracts that appeared legitimate while documenting agreements that would never see inside of courtroom. Kieran negotiated protections for Celeste and Ivy that were written into the terms with specificity that made them untouchable as long as the alliance held, insurance against future threats that had motivated his cooperation. Pavel signed with flourish that seemed almost mocking, but Kieran took satisfaction in knowing he'd converted threat into partnership that actually strengthened his position in Charleston's criminal ecosystem. But the victory felt hollow when he returned home to find Ivy drawing pictures of families holding hands beneath impossibly large suns, her 4-year-old artwork capturing innocence he'd almost destroyed through decisions made before he'd known she existed. Celeste looked up from where she was reviewing restaurant inventory with expression that told him she understood the cost of their safety, that the compromise he'd reached meant continuing involvement in operations he'd been trying to distance himself from. "Is it over?" she asked, and Kieran nodded while recognizing that over was relative term in world where alliances shifted and yesterday's partners became tomorrow's enemies, depending on circumstances beyond any individual's control. "For now," he said, pulling her close with need to feel her solid reality against him, proof that he'd managed to protect what mattered, despite the moral compromises required. "But I meant what I said about transitioning away from this life. The deal buys us time and safety, but I want out completely eventually." Celeste's arms tightened around him with understanding that eventually might take years they didn't have. That extraction from criminal operations wasn't a simple matter of deciding to walk away when roots ran as deep as his did into Charleston's underworld. 6 months passed with the kind of normalcy that felt surreal, given the violence that had preceded it, the Volkov alliance holding steady while Kieran systematically restructured his involvement to emphasize legitimate business operations over criminal facilitation. The restaurants expanded to 3 locations, all managed by Celeste with expertise that transformed them into destinations that drew tourists and locals equally, and Kieran found purpose in building something legal that could sustain them without the constant threat of arrest or retaliation. Ivy started kindergarten at a private school where security was tight, but invisible, her blonde curls bouncing as she ran to greet him each afternoon with stories about friends, and learning that filled the penthouse with joy he'd never imagined his life could contain. The proposal happened on a humid evening in early autumn, Charleston's summer heat finally breaking into temperatures that made the harbor breeze feel like relief, rather than just moving hot air around. Kieran had planned elaborate romantic gesture involving the restaurant's private dining room and flowers, and all the traditional elements he'd researched obsessively. But the moment crystallized unexpectedly, when Ivy asked why some of her friends had parents with the same last name while theirs were all different. The innocent question cut through pretense and planning, and Kieran found himself kneeling in their living room with ring he'd been carrying for weeks, while Celeste stared at him with shock that melted into tears. "I know this isn't the life you imagined when Ivy ran into a stranger in the dark," he said, words tumbling out without the polish he'd practiced but carrying truth that mattered more than eloquence. "But you've both transformed me into someone I didn't know I could be, and I want to spend whatever time I have making sure you never doubt how completely you're loved." Celeste's yes came through sobs that made Ivy concerned until they explained, happy crying, and suddenly the child was part of the embrace, small arms wrapping around both of them with fierce happiness. The wedding happened 2 months later in the restaurant's garden space. Small ceremony attended by staff who'd become family, and a carefully selected group of associates who could be trusted to celebrate without conducting business that would taint the occasion. Ivy served as flower girl with seriousness that made guests smile, her blonde curls crowned with roses that matched the ones in Celeste's bouquet, and Kieran felt his throat tighten watching his two favorite people process down an aisle he'd lined with lights that turned the garden into something magical. The vows he spoke came from heart he'd thought had calcified beyond repair, promises about protection and love and choosing them every day for the rest of his life. Their honeymoon was deliberately modest, a week at a beach house on Kiowa Island, where Ivy could hunt for shells, and they could exist as normal family without security details or business obligations intruding on time that belonged only to them. Kieran taught Ivy to body surf in gentle waves while Celeste watched from the shore with laughter that carried on the salt air, and he memorized the sound because it represented everything he'd been missing during years of pursuing success through channels that brought money but not meaning. The nights after Ivy fell asleep belonged to him and Celeste. Conversations ranging from dreams for the future to fears about whether his past would ever truly release its hold on their present. The transition away from criminal operations accelerated after the wedding, Kieran leveraging the Volkov alliance to extract himself from facilitating port operations while maintaining enough connection to ensure their continued protection. He sold his interests in ventures that couldn't be legitimized, funneling money into restaurant expansion and property investments that would provide income without requiring moral compromises that kept him awake at night. The established families accepted his withdrawal with understanding born of respect he'd earned through years of reliable service, and Pavel actually seemed amused by his domestication, making jokes about family life's civilizing influence at quarterly meetings. Ivy's 6th birthday party, 18 months after that night in the hospital emergency room, felt like celebration of more than just her growing up. It marked the anniversary of when Kieran's real life had begun, when a desperate child had crashed into him and somehow saved them both. The penthouse filled with kindergarten friends and their parents, who had no idea about the violence that had preceded this domestic normalcy, and Kieran found himself making small talk about school fundraisers and youth sports leagues, with the kind of engaged interest he'd once have found incomprehensible. Celeste moved through the chaos with grace that made his heart clench, her laughter mixing with children's shrieks and symphony that represented everything worth protecting. "You look happy," she said later after the guests had left, and Ivy was crashed in her room surrounded by new toys and the pleasant exhaustion of being celebrated. Kieran pulled his wife close with gratitude that threatened to overwhelm him regularly, still adjusting to the reality that this brilliant, fierce woman had chosen to build a life with him, despite knowing exactly who he'd been. "I am happy," he said, the simple truth feeling revolutionary, given how foreign the concept had been just 2 years ago, when his existence had been defined by isolation and transactions that left him empty, despite material success. The restaurant empire grew to 5 locations over the next 2 years, each one bearing Celeste's distinctive touch in menu design and atmosphere that made them destinations rather than just places to eat. Kieran discovered he had aptitude for legitimate business that had been wasted on criminal operations, his strategic thinking and people skills translating effectively to expansion that created jobs and contributed to Charleston's economy, rather than undermining it. The irony wasn't lost on him that he made less money running legal enterprises than he had facilitating port operations, but the ability to sleep without fear of federal raids or rival families made the financial sacrifice worthwhile. Ivy thrived in ways that made Kieran grateful daily for whatever instinct had made him stop when she'd grabbed his wrist that night, instead of shaking her off and continuing toward his car. She was bright and funny, and showed her mother's fierce determination in everything from playground disputes to homework assignments. She approached with intensity that would serve her well in life. The private school's counselor mentioned during parent-teacher conferences that Ivy occasionally talked about the night her mama got sick and the man who saved them, her 4-year-old memories already transforming into the kind of origin story that would shape how she understood her place in the world. "She thinks you're a hero," Celeste said after that conference, amusement and love mixing in her expression as they walked hand in hand through the historic district toward their car. "You are a hero to her, to both of us, regardless of what you did before we collided into your life." Kieran wasn't sure he deserved such generous interpretation of choices that had been equal parts self-interest and genuine concern, but he'd learned to accept grace when offered, rather than arguing against his own worthiness the way his younger self would have. The final severance from criminal operations came 3 years after that initial hospital visit, Kieran attending what would be his last meeting with the alliance of families he'd helped maintain through the Volkov expansion. Pavel was there, his organization now firmly established in Charleston's port operations, but surprisingly respectful of boundaries they'd negotiated during those tense days of threatened violence. "You were right to get out," Pavel said, during a private moment before the meeting began, and Kieran heard genuine respect in the words. "Family makes us vulnerable, but it also gives us reason to be more than what this world requires of us." The agreement they signed that night released Kieran from all obligations while maintaining the protections he'd negotiated for his family, insurance against future threats that would remain valid as long as the alliance held. He drove home through Charleston's familiar streets feeling lighter than he had in years, decades of accumulated weight finally released through decisions that prioritized love over power and connection over control. The penthouse glowed with warm light when he parked in the garage, and he could see Celeste and Ivy through the windows, his wife helping their daughter with homework at the dining table where they shared meals that tasted like family. "I'm completely out," he told Celeste after Ivy had gone to bed, the declaration feeling like exhaling breath he'd been holding since the night everything changed. She kissed him with celebration that communicated understanding of exactly what the transition had cost him and how completely she valued the choice he'd made. They stood on the balcony where they'd first kissed, Charleston spread out below them in lights that represented both who he'd been and who he was becoming, and Kieran felt gratitude for the collision that had knocked him off a path leading nowhere meaningful. The years that followed brought the ordinary challenges of family life, school plays and restaurant crises and teenage drama when Ivy hit adolescence with her mother's fierce independence and her father's strategic thinking. Kieran discovered that being present for normal life required different kind of courage than the violence he'd navigated in his criminal years, but the rewards were immeasurably greater than anything he'd accumulated through operations that had seemed important before he'd understood what actually mattered. Celeste built the restaurant group into Charleston Institution, her name recognized for culinary excellence, rather than the poverty she'd escaped through combination of determination and the chance encounter that had changed all their trajectories. They added 2 more children to their family over the years, a son who inherited Kieran's intensity, and a daughter who showed Celeste's grace under pressure, and the penthouse that had once been sterile showpiece transformed into home that echoed with the beautiful chaos of actual living. Ivy grew into teenager who rolled her eyes at parental embarrassment, but never doubted she was loved, her early memories of fear and uncertainty replaced by security that allowed her to take risks appropriate for her age. On quiet evenings when the younger children were asleep and Ivy was absorbed in homework, Kieran and Celeste would sit together watching the harbor and marveling at how a single moment of choosing compassion over convenience had created everything that made life worth living. Thank you all for following this story from that desperate night when a little girl found courage to ask a stranger for help through the years of transformation that followed. If you enjoyed this journey, please write in the comments from where you're watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing these stories to you. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most important moments in our lives arrive disguised as interruptions we never expected.